The Todd Shapiro Show.
Time to hit the button!
On Canada Talks, SiriusXM 167.
Lance Lambert from BovedaInc.com. I saw you just feels like a couple of minutes ago, but nice to have you back on the program. How are you?
I'm good, friend. How are you doing?
Good, man. How was the rest of O Cannabis?
It was good. It was good. Definitely, Saturday was a business-to-consumer day, so had a great turnout for that. I had to cut out a little early to fly back to the West Coast, but the team said the rest of the show was definitely good times.
So in the few hours that you're there on the, as opposed to the B2B, the business-to-business, and now the business-to-consumer, any new sort of surprising questions from the consumer aspect of sort of everything going on in the cannabis space?
No, interesting from the consumers, it seems to be a little bit more of statements, more so than questions, at least for the ones that are familiar with the brand, just giving their feedback on still coming across quite a bit dry flower up there in that market. So we got to hear some phenomenal testimonials from people that very much appreciate the product and tell us their personal stories on how it works for them, which has been great.
One of the things I see a lot that comes out in the news, and especially with LPs, whether they're rumors or whether they're people who wanted to bring down share price on certain companies and sort of these short attacks and stuff. But one of the things we keep hearing about that's popping up is that a lot of these LPs will have mold issues, a mold issue. Oh my God, another mold, a crop failure, a mold issue. And to be honest, I think to the average person, we don't even really know what that means, other than the fact that obviously it's bad cannabis. But how does... I mean, while your company doesn't touch the flower, you understand the process of growing, especially being in Southern Cal and outdoor grows and stuff. What really, Lance, take us through how a mold issue might arise.
Yeah, so, it's pretty common to find microbials and potential for mold in many things out there in the world, right? So the thing that differs, let's just say cannabis versus something like tobacco, is the fact that there's nothing to stop that mold from potentially growing if it hits into what we call the danger zone. So the recommendation from ASTM, which is International Standards Organization, they give a recommendation of cannabis to be kept between 55 and 65% RH. The 55%, they say any drier, you can have a problem with brittle trichomes and obviously lose the valuable terpenes from the flower. But more importantly is the top end of that spectrum. So when you get over 65% RH with the dry flower, that's where mold can actually start producing. You're creating that perfect environment. So almost think of it as bread that you put in the fridge that's in that same excessive moisture scenario that's left for a prolonged amount of time. Eventually mold is going to grow. So that's the one thing you do not want to consume, because obviously that can create some severe health issues, especially if you're consuming the cannabis by way of inhalation.
And if people are having difficulty with mold issues in terms of growing in their facilities, is that because, the indoor grow experience is imperfect still? It doesn't typically happen so much during the grow as it does post-harvest. So it's something that happens if, for some reason, the flower hasn't been dried down correctly. Because we go through certain just to kind of in basics. So you go through the growing process, you harvest, and then you put it in dry for at least a week to bring it down to a position to where you're ready to cure the flower, anywhere from a week to 4, 6 weeks. If somewhere along the way, if that cannabis isn't kept below that 65% RH, that's when you're creating the perfect environment. But again, you do have powdery molds that are very plausible in grow operations as well. Not as predominant on indoor, because typically you have a controlled environment, and they have positive pressure environments as well. But it's still something that's very plausible. So it's just a matter of keeping an eye on things, and you have to eradicate it immediately. So typically what happens if there is a room or if there's an area that's contaminated, they're literally having to go in and bleach the walls and bleach the racks and clear everything out of that room. And this is something that's done normally when you flip a room, as we say anyway. It's something it's imperative to do if there's any sort of microbial growth that you find. Can it sort of attach itself to the next grow?
Yeah, that's the problem. That's why bleach is our best friends, right? It's one thing that we know will prevent this mold from growing again. So our moms were onto something when they recommended wiping things down with bleach that potentially could cause any sort of cross-contamination. But it's similar to treat as you would salmonella or E. coli.
when you're handling, uncooked meats. It's that same thing where you really want to be cognizant of it and make sure that you are aware. And if you do see any powdery mold or anything that's even remotely close to it, that you go ahead, because black mold's very much a plausibility as well. And if you see it, you got to dispose of it and destroy it.
And is this something that is inevitable for some grow-ops or, legal grow-ops, or is it, part of the budget where they'll factor in a certain percentage will have issues? And because, this stuff really equates to, when you're having these types of issues, a massive, massive loss in revenues.
Oh, it's very true. When you lose a crop, just for example, let's say that your yield off of one of your rooms is 500 pounds, and fair market value FMP is approximately $1,000 to $1,200 US dollars. That can quickly add up. So exactly to your point, it's something you want to be cognizant of. A lot of companies do factor it in, but they try to be as proactive as possible. And it is definitely something that is a higher risk and a higher plausibility of happening in certain environments. Talking to friends that grow in Hawaii, in Jamaica, anywhere where you have, even the southern states, where you have a high level of humidity in the ambient, just in general, it's even more so a challenge. And that's honestly why a lot of them are fans of our product, because we don't just put out moisture, but in those instances, we're able to wick it out of the atmosphere and pull it in. And so that's something that definitely is a benefit for those situations where people want to keep that perfect balance of relative humidity.
And have you heard of, knowing sort of people within Southern Cal, big time grow-ups, what is an astronomical grow loss that you've heard due to mold, or maybe even fire could be there with a lot of the that the fires were happening last year. But have you heard of something like catastrophic, Lance?
Yeah, unfortunately, there was a catastrophic loss that occurred up in the Salinas Valley, which is in Northern California. There was a fire that was ignited. It was technically within a Dutch greenhouse area, but there was a substantial amount of loss, easily into the six figures, hundreds of thousands of dollars between the crop and all of the equipment. Because as simple as it sounds to just grow this plant, there's a lot of components that go into it, even in a greenhouse environment like a Dutch greenhouse, where you might have to offset the level of heat with an HVAC or some sort of recirc system. A lot of operations also have humid and dehumid systems as well. So even all the way down to the racking in the pots that they put these plants in, all those things are fixed costs on the operation side that can add up rather quickly. So we've heard of some big losses, unfortunately, for some of these guys that are in the big side.
And sometimes I would hear sort of reports within the cannabis industry, within Canada more specifically than the U.S., is that maybe these new LPs are trying to do it all, and maybe that's a mistake, because in a lot of other businesses you don't necessarily have the tomato growers also being the ones, it's usually farmers doing the growing is what I'm getting at, and within cannabis it's not really the farmers doing the growing, it's an LP trying to do it all, from growing to marketing to packaging to production to selling. And do you think that might change over time?
Yeah, it's something that we're here changing already. Spoke to a few LPs that they're going through those growth pains, but they're establishing logistics departments to handle everything post-harvest, or to handle everything on packaging for distribution. So it is one guy doing all at the smaller scales in many instances, but these larger companies, thankfully, are being able to establish divisions and kind of church and state between the production and the actual processing, packaging, and distribution side of their businesses. But you're right. It's similar to other crops, and it's not. You can compare it to tomatoes is the fairest comparison, but this crop is really hard to scale up when you compare it to, say, soybeans or corn. You can just plant another acre. If you have some sort of issue, you can eradicate it with maybe pesticides or herbicides, or maybe something natural like companion crops or insects like ladybugs that can help eradicate aphids and such. Those are things you can't necessarily do with this crop. So it means it's that much more imperative that, again, you're as proactive as possible and make sure you don't get yourself in this situation where you have mites or aphids or anything like that, above and beyond mold and such.
Do people underestimate how difficult it would be to grow that amount of marijuana?
I think so. So, a lot of these guys that came into the scene who have come on as growers, not just at LPs in Canada, but also in some of the larger operations in the States, they're finding themselves at a position to where they're only able to scale up the operation so far. There's things that they're used to doing, like making their formula, we call it the tea. So it's the actual water that you add to the plant during the grow process that you might add in other things, nutrients and such, in order to enhance the growth of the crop. You can do that to a certain level until you get to a point to where you need to utilize something like fertigation, where all of a sudden that puts that watering of the plant into an automated process. And there's a lot of growers that all of a sudden they find themselves in uncharted territories, and the LP or the large-scale producer is having to find someone that is accustomed to more of a large-scale operation. So there are some challenges along the way. It's not just throw a seed in the ground and go with it,
Yeah, I think that's what most people think. I think that's what I would think. What about I know in Ontario, in Canada, they have, I guess the legal part is you can grow 4 plants at home. That's got to be pretty easy though, right?
Yeah, typically so. I mean, that's, we joke around. There's a few books out there, like 3 Plants a Light is a good book that talks about, being able to do a small scale grow like that. Having said that, there's still things you always have to be cognizant of. You have to keep track of the ambient temperature, of the relative humidity in the room, following the plant all the way from germination through veg state, all the way until takedown. And then, again, you talk to a lot of these professional growers, Todd, and growing the plant's only half the battle, sometimes less. They talk about how much effort needs to put into drying, curing, storing, and properly handling the plant once you pull it down. So that's where a lot of people get lost. They said, I grew it right, I did it right, the flowers look beautiful, now it's time to process it, and they just don't have that level of experience and aptitude to be able to properly process the flowers. So it's a challenge. It's a lot harder than most things.
Lance Lambert from Boveda.com. We appreciate your time today. It sounds like it's a bit of a challenge talking about this. Are you at the airport right now?
I am. Props to Alaska for letting me hang out in the lounge and talk to you in a quiet place before my flight.
I can tell you're talking extra cautiously today. That's unlike you. We really do appreciate it, Lance. That was a great chat today. Bovedainc, Boveda.com. And thanks again for chilling with us on the show.
I always appreciate it, Todd. Looking forward to catching up again next week.
Okay, safe travels, my man.
Perfect. Thank you. Bye-bye, guys.
Bye.
This is the Todd Shapiro Show on Canada Talks, SiriusXM 167.